Buenos días a todos y me oís, ¿no? Sí, y bienvenidos a este desayuno organizado por la Fundación de la Innovación Bankinter, que en el que tenemos un nuevo formato. Esta es la segunda edición. El propósito de estos eventos no es más que compartir el conocimiento que ha adquirido la Fundación a lo largo de los poco más de 20 años de vida que tiene, gracias a la extensa red de expertos, tanto nacionales como internacionales, que tenemos en muy diversas materias, ¿no? Yo creo que la innovación para Bankinter ha sido siempre un pilar de nuestra estrategia, y la innovación es, si cabe, cada día más importante, porque vivimos en un mundo en el que el cambio es ya, el cambio acelerado, diría yo, es una constante, y por lo tanto es fundamental para las empresas, para tener éxito, incluso yo diría para sobrevivir, estar al tanto de las tendencias del entorno y poder valorar cuáles son los desafíos que estas suponen y también las oportunidades, por supuesto. Para nosotros en Bankinter, la Fundación es uno de los instrumentos que nos permite estar al día de esas tendencias, y uno de los propósitos de la Fundación es precisamente compartir ese conocimiento que nosotros adquirimos. El tema de hoy, yo creo que es muy sugerente, ¿no? África en transformación, innovación, liderazgo y oportunidades. Y es que África, aunque es un continente que tenemos muy cercano, es un gran desconocido que además yo creo que presenta retos que tiene que solventar y que requieren atención, pues desde los económicos, los de salud, todos los que tienen que ver con la sobrepoblación o la falta de infraestructuras, ¿no? Pero a la vez es un continente joven, enormemente dinámico, y que presenta, por lo tanto, muchas oportunidades de inversión. Para hablar de este tema, tenemos el honor de contar con un ilustre patrono de la Fundación, Jens Schulte-Bockum, que no solo es un experto en telecomunicaciones, también es un gran conocedor del continente africano. Jens ha sido consejero delegado de Vodafone en Alemania, y también ha sido Chief Operating Officer de MTM, que es el principal operador de telecomunicaciones en el continente africano. Jens, a lo largo de sus más de 8 años de carrera profesional en África, ha contribuido a conectar a más de 300 personas en 20 países, y además ha sido un gran impulsor de la digitalización en este continente. Yo estoy convencida de que no hay nadie mejor que Jens para hacernos descubrir este continente y, sobre todo, los retos que tiene y las oportunidades de inversión que supone para nosotros, y las oportunidades, sobre todo, para su población, que sueña con una vida mejor para ellos, sus familias y para sus territorios. Yo, sin más, les dejo con Jens, y muchas gracias por su atención.
Muchas gracias, Gloria. Necesito hablar en inglés. My Spanish is not so good, but I can understand what you said, and you've taken already some part of what I wanted to introduce, so thank you for that. I'd like to welcome you all, especially, of course, the members of the board of Bankinter and the senior leadership of the company. I understand there are many customers in the room, and it's a privilege for me to be here. It's really an honor and a personal delight to be able to be an advocate for Africa. I really feel that it's a good time to talk about the Africa opportunity, about what the continent can offer. We all have a very European view on Africa, and I hope in the course of this morning that I can correct some of the impression and maybe give you food for thought, some inspiration to think about Africa in a different way. As Gloria has mentioned, I had the privilege to spend the last 8 years of my life in Africa. I was based in Johannesburg and was Chief Operating Officer of a telecommunication group that spans about 20 countries in Africa. So I had the chance to travel a lot on the continent and experience the diversity and the richness of Africa. We very loosely talk about Africa. And if you think about when Americans talk about Europe, we take offense. because there is no such thing as one Europe. There are many different countries in Europe, and I think the same applies to Africa. So one of the messages that I hope you walk away with is that there is no one Africa. There is many, many Africas, many incarnations, many different countries, and I'll come to that in a little bit more detail. So the talk is going to be, on one hand, of course, about some facts and figures, but I also want to convey a little bit of sentiment. That's very difficult to translate in charts, and sometimes it's also difficult to put it in speech. But the Americans would say, I've been flashed by Africa. And there is a saying that people who go to Africa, they will always leave part of themselves on the continent. It's a very spiritual continent. It's an emotional continent with heartwarming people, with a lot of energy. And one of the things that you notice when you come back to Europe or you come back to the north is, we are a cooler society. We are older. Africa is a very, very young and vibrant continent. And I'll talk about that when I'll talk about demographics in Africa a little bit later as well. So there is a feeling about Africa. There's an emotion about Africa that will always be with me. And hopefully I can get that across as well. Now, the message that I want to convey is that the world needs Africa to work. As a world, we cannot afford Africa not to succeed. I think the ingredients are all there. It's incumbent on us to make the best of those ingredients. Now, let me go into the presentation. I hope I find out how this works. I have done what presenters do these days. I have shamelessly gone into ChatGPT. I've asked ChatGPT, what is the perception in Europe and in North America about Africa? And you can read for yourself. I'm not going to read out everything that's on the chart, but as you see, there is a lot of ambivalence between the opportunities of Africa, but then, of course, also the risks that are associated with the continent. And of course, there's a lot of macroeconomic and political volatility. There's perception about instability, perception about crime. And let me tell you one story to maybe break the ice a little bit. When I first arrived on my first visit to Lagos in Nigeria, I was taken into the city with a chauffeur. I was picked up with a protocol officer at the airport. And then half the way into the city, I noticed that the chauffeur was getting very, very nervous. And I asked the chauffeur, what's going on? Why are you so nervous? Because he was not driving, he was slowing down. And he said, I lost a security vehicle. And I said, I didn't know there was a security vehicle. And it turns out that there was another vehicle with armed guards that was protecting me in the middle of a city of 25 million people of Lagos, going from the airport to my hotel. So instability, security clearly is an issue in Africa. And you need patience in a continent that has that level of volatility. I've been a telecoms person for a very, very long time of my life, and I've operated in very stable environments in the Netherlands, in Germany, in the UK. And you focus on business, on operations. When you are a manager or an executive or a board member in Africa, I would say 50% of your attention is spent on external factors, on politics, on macroeconomic influences, currency fluctuation, all of these things. And you have to accept that there are shocks to the system that are disproportionate to what you can do operationally. But the underlying businesses in Africa are all very, very strong. I think that is also what ChatGPT says. There is good returns fundamentally on business in Africa, as I will show later. But sometimes these returns can be thrown off by currency depreciations that are amazing. And I'll talk a little bit with an example about that later. Now, the other thing that you see in Africa is, of course, or that we think about Africa, associate with Africa, is the fear of migration. So, and we have to be honest about that. It's in everybody's back of the mind. Is all of Africa now coming to Europe? And of course, we see the boat migrants coming on the Strait of Gibraltar, or they come onto Lampedusa, into Italy, and so forth. And there is a huge fear that that migration will be massive. And there is a perception that the migration is driven by poverty. And I would argue it's not driven by poverty. The poor people don't have a chance to come to Europe. The people who come to Europe, interestingly, are typically middle-class people, because they have to fork out $5,000 to $10,000 to bribe the people who bring them to Europe. Very, very few people in Africa have that kind of money. You have to be upper middle class or better. So, and why are they coming? They are not necessarily coming because they are poor. They are coming because of the political instability, because they don't see opportunities to develop themselves professionally in environments that are extremely challenged, in some cases very corrupt. And so I think that's a big factor that is driving migration. And I don't have an answer to that, but I think we need to do everything from a European perspective to support more stability in Africa on the political level, and to set the right incentives in Africa to improve governance. Sorry, is that? I didn't go forward. Here we go. It's working now. So what I wanted to illustrate next is I found this extremely interesting graph here that showcases the true size of Africa. And if you think about it, it's truly mind-boggling. We are all used, when we look at our school books, we all learned the Mercator projection. That's how the globe, the map of the globe, is projected on 2 dimensions. It was invented by Mercator in the 16th century. Unfortunately, is not truthful to the size of the countries. So the further away you are from the equator, the larger the projection becomes relative to the true size. So there is an alternative projection which has been used here, and it's been illustrated by superimposing the continent of Africa with other major geographies in the world, noticeably China and the US. And you can see here that Africa is vastly larger. It's about 3 times the size of the US or China, respectively. And it's about 9 times the size of India, even though Africa has the same population as India, 1.4 billion. And I think that should maybe do away with another misconception that a lot of people have about Africa. We still think of Africa as the continent of hunger. We are the Band-Aid generation. No, we saw what was happening in Ethiopia in the 80s, and we were emotionally moved by the outpouring of international help into the continent. Some people in the room probably even remember the Biafra wars, the Sahel situation, and so forth. So that perception is still very much there. But as you can see, Africa, just from a sheer size, should be perfectly capable to feed itself. I would argue that if things go well, in the 21st century, Africa can become a massive net exporter of agricultural produce. And Africa today already, of course, is producing a lot of cash crops that are coming into Europe. The continent certainly has the size. And of course, some people may say, well, what about the deserts? Yes, there are deserts, but the arable land, the share of arable land in Africa is very comparable to India. And it's 9 times larger, same population. So there is a lot of pathway. What also sometimes gets forgotten, I mentioned we talk about one Africa. In reality, it's 54 countries. The 54 countries were largely defined by European colonial powers. They went on the map, they drew straight lines and said, okay, that's the border. Okay. Now, that is cutting through the historic ethnic groupings in Africa. And there are about 3,000 ethnic groups with 2,000 languages. So there's an enormous complexity underlying the continent. The country where I left, South Africa, has 11 official languages. Just South Africa. And that is arguably not the most diverse country. In Nigeria, they estimate it's about 300 languages just in Nigeria, and there are 4 large groups in the country, ethnic groups, subgroups in a way, that went to war with each other because of the ethnic tensions that ultimately drove to something like the Biafra War between the different subsections. And of course, what I'm not mentioning on the chart is the religious diversity in Africa is massive as well. I mentioned already, it's a very spiritual continent. It's a continent where adherence to faith, compared to what we're used to in Europe, is still very, very high. And that applies both to the Christian churches, but also to Islam. And of course, large parts of Africa in the north are Islamic, but the border between Islam and Christianity cuts through many countries, particularly in West Africa. When the colonial powers came to West Africa, they all wanted a share of the coast. So if you look at the countries, you have Côte d'Ivoire, Togo, Benin, Nigeria, they cut it up in slices. But in reality, the ethnic and the religious composition is horizontal. The southern part is Christian and mostly farming communities. The northern part, the more you go into the Sahel, becomes nomadic and Islamic and is driven historically by thousands of years of migration from Sudan to the west. So there is much more ethnic commonality horizontally, but the European cut that side of Africa up vertically, which is an illustration on, how arbitrary things are and about what is going on. Another point that I wanted to make about the size of Africa, when I fly from the north of Europe, typically from Germany or from Amsterdam or London to Johannesburg, which I still do a lot, it's an 11-hour flight. 2 hours are over Europe. 9 hours are over Africa. And the planes are not flying more slowly in Africa. It's just a very, very big continent. Now let me move on and go a little bit into geopolitics. Now, there is renewed interest in Africa right now in the context of the geopolitical rivalry between China and the United States. And what is probably hidden from view for many in Europe is that both the US and China are aggressively putting their stakes down in Africa these days. The US is waking up again to the fact that China has really carved out some level of dominance. And I'm giving some statistics here, but the trade volume that China has with the continent is now 6 times the size of the American-African trade. 20 years ago, American trade was larger than Chinese trade. So that has gone to a total imbalance within half a generation, you could say. Now, that doesn't mean that the US isn't important. The US historically has had a huge sway over Africa with investment interests, but also with extending trade privileges. There is an international agreement called AGOA that allows many African countries to export into the US at no tax. Now, you can imagine with the Trump administration that is put at risk, and it's not quite clear what the outcome would be. It's been reported, there is this funny story about the case of Lesotho, when Trump talked about his basically proportionate tariffs on the 2nd of April, Lesotho, which is one of the poorest and smallest countries in Africa, featured pretty much on top of the list. I believe it was a 54% tariff, if I recall the number correctly. And that's because Lesotho is home to a very strong textile industry that does, in fact, export significantly to the US. It doesn't take a lot of imports from the US because it's such a poor country. So they got slapped with a 54% tariff, which would be a disaster for. That would literally wipe out the economy of Lesotho if it stayed that way. So I think Trump is learning about Africa, but because the Americans have a massive strategic interest to fend off the Chinese dominance in Africa and to ensure that they retain access to rare minerals, rare earths in countries like DRC and others, I think they will have to rethink their Africa policy again. And there is a lot of initiative going on that is maybe less visible right now on the American side as well to rebuild their position in Africa. Let me also give you some examples from my own experience about the Chinese influence in Africa. A couple of years ago, my wife, who is here, and I flew to Victoria Falls, and we landed in Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe. So some people may have been there. The airport in Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe is a brand new airport. It's a shining airport in the middle of nowhere. It is a small place, only tourists go there. It's an airport that, would be a wonderful airport to have in Ibiza or in any, medium-sized airport in Europe. Completely built with Chinese money. The Chinese come, they build everything. They bring their own people, they bring their own material, they build everything. The technology comes from China, everything works, it's shiny, it's wonderful. And then in turn, they get mining rights somewhere in the country. They basically say, okay, you give me that stretch, and I have the mining rights for platinum or copper or whatever it is. When you go to Namibia, there are whole uranium mines. Namibia is one of the few global sources of uranium, which obviously for fission energy production is a critical element. China has gone there. They built their own mines. They bring their own people. There's not a single Namibian working in the mines. It's all Chinese people that are flown in from China. So that is definitely going on. And I've seen, of course, also in my industry, a big scramble for supply. So our supplier for the technical equipment in telecoms are mostly Chinese because their pricing is a lot more aggressive. And you have, of course, the same debate in Europe around Huawei and the security threat. Now, in Africa, people are pragmatic. We are not affiliated to the US or in the same way as here in Spain is to NATO and the Western world. So they will take whatever is more convenient. Now, we need to have a balance, so we still retain some relationships with the likes of Ericsson and Nokia, but Huawei and ZTE, the Chinese suppliers, have gone from very little share to probably 70 to 80% market share in telecoms technology in Africa within very, very little time. And that has been one of the explanatory factors about the trade imbalances between China and the US that I talked about. Now, a few highlights that really talk to why Africa is a land of opportunity. If you think about what's happening globally in demographics in the world labor pool, between now and 2050, there is an expectation that the world will add 800 million people to the labor pool. Africa alone will add 800 million people between now and 2050 to the global labor pool. So does that mean there's nothing happening everywhere else? No, of course not. But the net in all the other continents is zero. We have China, Europe, North America decreasing in population. The labor pool is shrinking. There is still, of course, India and some other Asian countries where the labor pool is growing, but the net additions to the global labor pool are all coming from Africa. Let's see if that conference room can help us out here a little bit. So I think that's maybe the most important figure in this whole chart. In addition, of course, you're looking at a continent, I've already mentioned the youthfulness. The median age is 19. Now, median age, just to remind everybody, means that half the population is younger than 19. Can you imagine? You go into any city, you go into any village, half of the people are children. It's incredible. So the energy is just incredible. But it also means, and I will illustrate that in a minute, that the parents of the next generation are already born. So in our head, when we think about population growth and population control, there is this notion, oh, you know, they have 6 children and that's why it's growing so far. No. The birth rates are coming down, not to 2, but to 2.5. They're coming down everywhere in Africa. But because the parents of the next generation are already born, there is still runway for the populations to grow, and I'm going to illustrate that in a minute. Now, I would also like to share a little bit of, again, personal anecdotes from traveling in Africa. When you drive in Uganda, you arrive, the airport is at Lake Victoria, at Entebbe. And you have to drive to the city of Kampala, which is the capital city where our offices were. It's a relatively heavily populated area, and now they've built a new road. In the old days, when I arrived, there was still an old road, and it would take you up to 2 hours to get to Kampala. Now it's 45 minutes on the new road. If you take the old road, you see what's going on, and you see every 500 meters there's a private school. Every 500 meters there's a private school. So you see that wherever there is a middle class emerging in Africa, people are investing into education. So this is not just going to be impoverished masses that are going to swarm the planet. I think we are seeing a demographic revolution that will also bring quality and talent to the global labor pool that will be desperately needed. And of course, if I'm in the country of Spain, of course, I understand that. Spain has benefited over the last generation from massive migration from Latin America. My own country, Germany, has benefited in the last 30 years from massive migration from Eastern Europe, from Poland, from Hungary, from the Czech Republic. If you look at the demographics of Eastern Europe and of Latin America, populations are shrinking. Next 30 years, we're not going to have the same level of immigration to Spain. We're not going to have the same level of immigration to Germany from these origination countries. We will have to look at Africa. To illustrate that even more, I found this fascinating picture. It's a little bit dated. It's 3 years old. It talks about 2022. And it illustrates where are the next 1,000 babies born on the planet. A third of the babies born on the planet, as we sit here, in the next hour, in the next day, in the next year, will come from Africa. About 40%, maybe a little bit more, will still come from Asia. But as we already discussed, some populations in Asia, South Korea, Japan, China are starting to shrink. The replacement rate is not met anymore. India is still growing somewhat, but decreasing fast, the population rate. Africa is going to still grow. And somebody told me, which is an interesting way to look at it, if you think about the sort code for the world, I explained it to you. The sort code of the world is 1114. 1 billion in the Americas, 1 billion in Europe, 1 billion in Africa, 4 billion in Asia. 7 billion people. That's the sort code, let's say, of the year 2000. The sort code of the world in the year 2080 will be 1144. I don't have to explain, no? 4 billion people expected in Africa, 2080, same size of population as Asia. And you see here why this is happening and the underlying trends. And you can also see here, if you look at the demographic pyramid comparison between, I've taken Nigeria and the US, you see 2 trees. You know, one tree looks very healthy and the other tree, well, let me say, maybe a little bit distorted. But if you look at the fine print, I'm not going to read out everything that's on the chart, but there are already today more children younger than 10 in Nigeria than in the United States. It's about 50% more. So based on that, and these children will become parents. They may not have 6 children, but if they have 2 or 3 children, Nigeria is going to 400 million people in 2050. It's going to 600 to 800 people, there are different estimates, in 2080. This is going to be the 3rd largest country on the planet. Probably double the size of where the US will be, even if you factor in immigration, and whether immigration will continue to happen in Europe and the US is, of course, also a political question. So from a pure demographic perspective, there is an avalanche, and it's already translating into growth rates. I've picked some examples here of African countries that are materially outgrowing what we see in the US or even what we see in China. The trend growth in Africa overall right now is a bit better than 4%. And I will explain later that in my view it should be higher, it could be higher. The trend growth could be very similar to what we've seen in China and India in the last, in China's case, 30 years, in India's case, the last 10 years. It should be around 6 to 7% growth CAGR. And at that level, you see rapid economic development. And again, to illustrate that, one of the countries that we operate in is Ghana. I was first in Accra in 2017 when I started. And I was back in Accra last year. Just within 7 years, the amount of infrastructure investment, of new roads, of airport upgrades, of new hotels, of new office buildings is incredible. It feels like the city has doubled in 7 years. And that's the level of transformation that you see in fast-growing societies. So what Africa needs clearly is some champions. We need champions that become the lions of Africa as we had the Asian tigers. And I think Ghana could be a candidate. Countries like in East Africa in particular, like Kenya could be, or Rwanda could be a candidate, but it's very uneven, and I'll talk about the geographic or the dispersion a little bit more in a minute. Now, before I get there, let's also make sure that we don't forget that the wealth distribution in Africa is still extremely challenging and extremely uneven. So I have to tell you a funny story about this chart. This is generated by ChatGPT. But I cross-checked the data, so the data sources are given, so data sources are valid. I asked ChatGPT first to get me the data. I said, okay, there is the bottom of the pyramid principle. I want to have income distributions. You look at certain cutoffs. The new standard of extreme poverty set by the UN is $2.15 a day. You can see 38%, almost 4 in 10 Africans are still in extreme poverty. Another 3 in 10 Africans are very, very poor. So they have very limited means. So only, let's say, there are 30% that have a decent quality of life. That's a message here. So then I asked ChatGPT, draw me a graph. And you've all heard about hallucination. I got a graph, it's still in my inbox from ChatGPT, that omitted the 32%. It didn't add up to 100%. I said, ChatGPT, you must do better. Give me the 32% back. And then it put out this graph. And it's a correct graph. I can assure you the numbers are correct. And you see the definitions of the different, let's say, human development index levels on the right-hand side. Also to basically support that with data that we have inside MTN into my own group. We see in most of the sub-Saharan markets a population penetration of telecommunications around 50 to 60%. So we are not reaching the last 40% of the population yet, not even with basic telephony services. We are pushing hard, but people need every cent they make for food, for sustenance. They can't afford anything. We'll see later also it correlates with electrification levels. We still have practically half of the population in sub-Saharan Africa without electricity. So poverty remains a clear challenge. And there's a high concentration of wealth. We make 80% of our revenues with the top 20% of the population that we can serve. So let's go a little bit into more regions. I've talked a lot about general African statistics, but as I explained at the beginning, the real Africa is 54 countries. It's many ethnicities. It's different regions. And here I wanted to pull out a little bit sentiment of different regional dynamics. Now, North Africa is closest to us. It's closest to Spain. There's a lot of trading relationship, and particularly to Morocco, to Algeria on gas, historically, of course, as well. North Africa has been very challenged with particularly big countries like Egypt going through major macroeconomic instability, IMF programs, currency reform. So they are on the mend again. But generally, if you look at the economics, it's relatively resilience, slow growth, but with a high potential to benefit from the proximity to Europe. If you go to East Africa, that's where the action is right now. So East Africa, practically all major countries. I have to say the countries that are not in a war situation like Sudan, of course, is a very special case, but Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, all outperforming. They are all growing around 6% or better. And the interesting observation is, and you see that in the upper right-hand side, the countries that don't have the resources currently grow faster than the countries that are commodity dependent. So the oil dependent countries or mineral dependent countries are growing a little bit more slowly. Countries like Kenya have a very diversified economy. When you buy roses in Madrid, they are likely to come out of Kenya. So there is agriculture, there is some level of manufacturing, there is even some level of IT outsourcing. There is not a lot of natural resources in a country like Kenya. They are outperforming. Countries like, on the other hand, when we go to West Africa, the big unknown is the future of Nigeria. I would say Nigeria is the case that makes or breaks Africa. 1 in 6 African lives in Nigeria. The last 10 years, Nigeria has grown only 2% on average per year. That's in line with population growth, so there is no real progress. It's totally dependent on oil exports. 95% of the exports of Nigeria are oil, and it has been heavily influenced by politics. Now, there is a new administration that is undergoing very, very hard reforms. They have done away with fuel subsidies. They are liberating the currency. I'll talk about that in a minute as well, because we've been hit hard by that. But fundamentally, it's the right level of reform in a country like Nigeria. For us, it's the largest market in Africa, but it's also the slowest growing country, large country in Africa. So that needs to turn around. And you see other West African countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, Ghana are also showing the ability to grow 6% per annum trend growth. So it's there. And West Africa is the most heavily populated part of the continent. Almost half of the population in Africa is in West Africa, if you look at that collectively. Now, to illustrate the level of currency volatility, 2 years ago, you needed 460 Nigerian naira to buy a dollar. Now you need 1,600 naira to buy a dollar. So it's a factor, more than a factor 3. I'll show later when I talk a little bit about MTM what that has done to our own results. You can imagine that the currency translation into dollars has collapsed, the margins have collapsed. So that's the type of volatility that you need to experience and to anticipate. But now we are growing 40–50% in Nigeria again. So we will catch up, but you need to wait sometimes to catch up. And then finally, South Africa. South Africa, or the Southern African SADC region, is very much dominated by the South African economy. South African economy has been held back by poor governance under the Zuma years. There is some reform right now. It's still a little bit unclear whether it will ultimately prevail, but of course South Africa is by far the most developed country in Africa, and I'm quite hopeful that they will start to turn around very, very slowly. But the key message here is, for anybody who has investment interest into Africa, is you have to choose wisely. You have to do your diligence. You have to understand the specifics of the countries. there is different currency regimes in West Africa. A lot of the Francophone Afrique is on the euro effectively. They have currencies that are tied to the euro, so that gives you lower interest rates and much more stability. And then you have countries that have reasonably well-managed domestic currencies. I would quote, as examples, Uganda, Rwanda, relatively stable. And you have the basket cases where we've had mismanagement at the macroeconomic and political level, like in Egypt or in Nigeria. And unfortunately, this has affected some of the large countries in Africa. Because, Nigeria is more than 200 million people. Egypt is more than 100 million people. Ethiopia, more than 100 million people. These countries have mismanaged their currencies, and they are going through very, very painful adjustment periods. But you can still pick a lot of smaller African countries as this evidences that are just doing fine. Now, let me give you some color on where the real opportunities are. And when I prepared for this speech, of course, the Bankinter people said, you have to give us some pointers. Where are the real opportunities? Where should Spanish industry potentially go? Now, what I've tried to do here is I've tried to list some of the assets that Africa brings economically, some of the development gaps, and then you can make an inference on which sectors are going to be the most attractive. And I will show in a minute that there's already a fair amount of activity going on in these sectors. But you see oftentimes that the development gaps, you can also think of as opportunities. So little VC capital, but there is a lot of young people. There's a lot of creativity in Africa, I will show. So venture capital can come to Africa. You see, we have still a lot of subsistent agriculture. But 60% of the arable land that is not used, that's not plowed in the world, is in Africa. Now, Spain has enormous resources and talent and expertise in agriculture. The cash crops in Africa, whether it's mangoes or avos or roses or, of course, coffee and cocoa and so forth, are waiting to be professionalized. If you look at all labor-intensive industries, Africa should be on your mind. So if you're worried about lack of talent, if you're worried about rising labor costs, if you feel that with wages now in Europe, including tax and benefits and so forth, hourly wages in industry in Europe, they are practically nowhere in Europe below 25, 30 euros. That's a lot of money. If you're worried about that, if that is a dependency you have as a company, Africa can be your place. There is an almost infinite labor pool. It's not in China anymore. China is upgrading very, very fast. It may still be in places like Bangladesh, Indonesia, and so forth, but Africa is much closer, and it's a very rich labor pool to exploit. So that's why I also believe that we will see some surprise new industries emerging in Africa. For instance, elderly services and healthcare services, very, very likely that we will have communities of Europeans going to Africa to seek care because the people are there, the headcount is there. That may not happen in the next 5 years, but it may happen in the next 10 or 15 years. There's two choices. Either we bring the caregivers to Europe, or we bring the people that need the care to places where there is an abundance of labor, and there is an abundance of labor in Africa. Some of that has already happened. Go to a hospital anywhere in Northern Europe, you'll see a lot of Africans already working the hospitals and the care homes in Europe. So these are the type of opportunities. And then there are some specific areas that are, of course, very emblematic for Africa. And we will see that's where the large-scale investment is. It's on the infrastructure side and renewable energy side. Energy revolution is happening because you have only half of the population electrified. There's massive opportunity. There's abundance of sun. There's a lot of wind power opportunity as well. The hydrogen economy has obviously a high potential in Africa as well. And then the other big sector is financial services and particularly fintech. And I'm going to illustrate that on the next two charts. I'm coming to the end, I can assure you, with a few examples. So this is again, ChatGPT has worked for me. I've asked ChatGPT, give me the largest examples of foreign direct investment. No, it's very small print. You don't have to read it all. And some of it is hallucination, because these are projects that were part of an intergovernmental declaration between the UAE and, building new cities in Egypt or South Africa. I would take it with a pinch of salt, let me put it that way. Not all of that is going to happen. But you see, if you can read the numbers, the investment sums are in the billions. And most of this is for urban development or for infrastructure development or primarily for energy projects. So you see a lot of renewable energy projects coming up in Africa as well. And of course, I've also asked ChatGPT, what is Spain doing there? And ChatGPT said, yeah, there are investors from Spain like Elecnor, Acciona, Abengoa, Gamesa, CAF, Ferrovial. So a lot of these companies are already active in Africa with large projects. So for instance, there is a big solar complex in Morocco called the Noor Ouarzazate complex, which is funded by Spanish investors. There's a massive Lake Turkana wind tower project in Kenya. That's another example. So it's happening, but still I would say, you see here on the list, Spain is not explicitly mentioned. Spain is relatively low profile still in Africa. But I give you another interesting data point. From the exports of Spain that don't go to Europe, which of course is the vast majority of exports, but from the rest, 19% already go to Africa. So Africa is starting to be a relevant trading partner, and a lot of it has to do with the intra-industrial trade, with the outsourcing of car manufacturing to Morocco. Morocco is now the second largest car exporter into the European Union. Imagine, second largest in volume is Morocco. So it's starting to happen. Then I talked about the startup activity, and here you can see VC capital is there. It's not a lot, but it's generating very, very healthy innovations and very, very healthy unicorns. And practically all of the unicorns are in the fintech domain. Financial service applications, super apps, new microfinance-based products, new micro-insurance-based products. So this is where the hot action is right now. And the emerging hotspots in Africa are Johannesburg and Lagos as the two cities that drive a lot of the startup activity. Now, this is not Silicon Valley. This is Lagos Valley in a way. But with the youthfulness, with the creativity, and with the boom of higher education that is going on in Africa, I think we will see quite a bit more startups coming through. Now, let me finish off a little bit with a commercial interruption to talk about my own company. I'm still very much affiliated with MTN. I'm not active as Chief Operating Officer anymore, but I serve on several of MTN's boards, including the boards in Nigeria and in South Africa. So I'm very, very close to the company. Here are some of our latest numbers. So it's about a $10 billion revenue number, but with 300 million customers. So you're all good in mathematics? Okay, sometimes you get the digits wrong, okay? I know, it's a common problem. But that's $3 per month per customer. That's the average revenue we make. You need then 300 million customers to get to 10 billion. I had the same revenue in Germany with 30 million customers, because the ARPU, the average revenue there is more like $30 or $25. So, but you see also the underlying growth is very, very strong. You see that we are active as a company in two fields. We are digitizing the continent, but we are also working on financial inclusion. So we are very much involved in mobile money. In the last 8 years, we've doubled the number of active data subscribers. That was about 70 million. It's now more than 150 million people. And if you think about what that means, it's another 80 million people that have access to the internet for the first time in their life. Just imagine. If you look at the fintech numbers, I believe in 2017 we had 18 million people in financial services. We are now north of 60. So that's gone up by a factor 4. So there's very, very strong underlying growth. I already explained the conundrum that we had, particularly last year in Nigeria, and you see our EBITDA margin, 32%. It's not a very good margin for our industry. A year earlier, our margin was 40%. So that's the damage that came from the currency revaluations of Nigeria. I'm pretty hopeful. That also tells you something about the volatility. We'll get quite close to the 40% again this year, I think, unless there is, I mean, I'm not giving forecasts. No, that's very clearly, I'm not in the position to give any financial advice, but it's going to swing back simply because, you know, after a short while, you can intercept it by growth. And I think it's also interesting to see that, you know, with what we're doing, we're covering roughly half the population of the continent, roughly 700 million people are in our, let's say, call it catchment areas. And of course, the ambition needs to be to connect all of them, rather than only 300 million. Now, we have a few competitors as well. So the overall level of connectivity in that footprint is higher. But, you know, we tend to be market leaders in most of the markets that we operate in. And yeah, I'd appreciate any interest on MTN as well. So maybe that's a good final encouraging example that you can do business, but you have to be there for the long haul. We celebrated 30 years of MTN last year. And I think if you want to invest in Africa, don't think you can walk away with huge profits after 2 or 3 years. You have to be in there for the long game. But based on the demographics that we saw, based on the size of the continent, the opportunity, the level of development needs, I think there is a huge pathway for economic growth. And companies that have anything remotely to do with anything that's going on in Africa and that are ignoring the continent will ignore it at their peril. Thank you very much.